Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to go through a list of some winter book recommendations, and obviously what that specifically entails is different from person to person, so I am going to be going through quite a lot of books today. That way, no matter what you specifically are looking for a winter book, hopefully there will be something on this list that meets that. Before I jump into my recommendations, if you have any of your own, feel free to leave those in the comments. Don't worry whatsoever about if I end up saying the very thing that you comment, as I actually think that that just reaffirms to anybody looking for recommendations that if there's more than one person saying the same thing, that's probably a pretty good one to check out. A quick heads up that I will be doing a video on some holiday books. I mean, maybe she'll become less terrible, but I'm like, it's a pretty big hill to climb. Since I have indeed completed the book that entails the life of this idiot character. And one guy's biggest fault was pretty much that he was Scottish. What is this? Okay. I'm not going to include any of those books today, but if that's more so what you're looking for, be on the lookout. That video will be up very soon. Jumping into the recommendations, the first group is going to fall under the umbrella of being more Norse and Viking inspired. Some of these are fantasy, some of them are historical fiction, and some of them are a little bit of a combination of both those things. So we have the Bloodsworn Saga by John Gwynne, Children of Ragnarok, The Weaver and the Witch Queen, A Fate Inked in Blood, and Vinland Saga. So all of these things, despite all falling under this umbrella, they actually, I would say, scratch a different itch depending on what you are looking for. So as an example, A Fate Inked in Blood is a very Norse-inspired fantasy romance story. If you've never checked out anything by Danielle Jensen, you are a fantasy romance fan, I would say that this one is going to be a lot more magic leaning than her other popular series, The Bridge Kingdom. But here, it was fun to see her take something that is somewhat familiar to a lot of us, a lot of these Norse inspirations, and then put her own spin on it. I think she accomplished that well. I do think that this one is a little tropey, and it does meet a lot of the popular tropes, and maybe if you're like, I just want to have a fun action-adventure fantasy romance, Norse-inspired, give it to me, like all the tropes, then I think that this one's going to really fit that. It is quite fast-paced, and I would say it has a lot of stakes that continue to increase as the story goes on. So it is quite edge of your seat. And speaking of edge of your seat, the Bloodsworn Saga, I feel like, ends up having some of the most intense battle sequences that you can ask for in fantasy. I would say a huge portion of the last book in this trilogy, almost 2/3 maybe of the last book, just felt like race to the finish line. We have this action starting, and it's this snowball effect where eventually the snowball just turns into an avalanche and we have this explosive ending. But we do take the time to build. So in the first book in the series, you are following 3 perspectives, and then you get to know them pretty well, and you're getting glimpses of the lore in the background. And then I would say within book 2 is when you start to see the characters' plot lines coming together a lot more. The lore really comes to life. And then, as I already described, that last book is extremely explosive. Not to say there's not action along the way, because there certainly is. So I was describing A Fate Inked in Blood as kind of action-adventure. If you just want like brutal action and that historical feeling of like, what if gods were giant wolves? If you're looking for something like that, Bloodsworn Saga is going to fit it very well. Children of Ragnarok is by a beloved author, Cindy Williams-Chima. Very underhyped though. I definitely think that this has not gotten the attention that it deserves. I believe it's a completed duology at this point. I've only read the first in this series, but I really liked the first one. I liked the inspirations. I do think there's a lot more to do with rune magic than maybe you're going to see in some of the other ones talked about under this umbrella. And I feel that something that this author continues to do very well is write very realistically flawed but likable characters. And I think that was very present in this book. There's just something about how they behave that it just genuinely feels like a real person. And as a result, you find yourself really captivated by their stories, even when you are a little lost, or even when you don't quite know what's going on, or maybe even when you don't agree with the decisions they're making. You just genuinely feel like that's a real human being, and you're curious how the events occurring around them is going to affect them. And then once you get to know them a little better, then you can start to predict, and then you can start to worry. And I just think that actually establishes stakes in a very quiet and subtle way. After that, we have Vinland Saga. Vinland Saga is something that I feel that initially it takes some time to get into, because it does sort of just feel like it is a lot of bloodshed, and that it's just trying to hit the cool factor of Aren't Vikings awesome though? And that is so not at all what that story has to offer, even if at first, when you first give it a try, that might be what it feels like, because of the fact that I feel like it's trying to capture that feeling of a saga, of a story that is larger than life, and thus the characters are larger than life, and their capabilities are far beyond what a human is actually able to do. It utilizes that form of storytelling, and thus, at first, it just seems like everything is very extreme. But the quiet thematic elements that are present within this are absolutely devastating and incredibly heartbreaking, and I still to this day feel that Vinland Saga is one of the best examples of a revenge story done right. And on top of that, really asks the question of who truly is a villain. I am going to be that snob. I'm so sorry. If you check out the anime, I do think that the sub is a lot better. But anyway, the last one for this umbrella of the Norse and Viking inspired would be The Weaver and the Witch Queen. This author has written another work, The Witch's Heart, that also can fall under this category. I do think that The Weaver and the Witch Queen, while I liked the other a little bit more, I think from an emotional standpoint, I think as far as feeling winter as a part of the story, I think that fits this one a little bit better, as a lot of the story is looking at how these people traverse this very difficult landscape as a result of the sea, as a result of how brutal the cold can really be, and how much life and death situations are dependent on just the whims, you could say, of nature. But then on top of that, does that influence people and the brutality of them, and does it justify it? The setup more specifically is that you have these three characters that care very much about each other. They are essentially all like sisters, and then as they grow up, one of them becomes much more independent. One of the others is kidnapped. The one who has kind of had this more independent streak in her is doing what she can to help the other. She kind of goes on this quest to get this person back, and then the additional character goes along with them, and they themselves and their personalities are quite different, so they respond to situations very differently, and you're just seeing the ways that their environments can really have an impact on them. It's quite compelling. I quite enjoyed this one, and surprisingly, I feel like it has very complex. I don't want to give the impression that this is fantasy romance, because it's not, but I do feel like the romantic elements that are present with this are actually very, very complex. Next up, I wanted to mention some cozy stories, as I know not everybody is looking to be reminded of how brutal the cold can be. Sometimes they want an escape from that, and they want that feeling of, I'm sitting by a fire and I'm warming myself up, but in a book. And so I wanted to give a couple of warm hug in a book type of recommendations. These I think are very present in fall recommendation videos as well for similar reasons. But the two that I wanted to mention would be the Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, as well as the Spellshop. The Spellshop is a newer story that has been categorized in things like the Goodreads nominees as fantasy romance. Is there romantic subplot that is fairly prevalent in the story? Yes. However, I would more so categorize this as cozy fantasy, as so many of the themes are not just about the romance, but rather how a person comes to find that found family within a story and has this sense of community, and they care about those around them and how those around them care about them. And with the main character in this story, she does have a lot of social anxiety, and so we are not only looking at found family, but how to navigate that from a perspective of somebody who has a hard time just even putting themselves out there and going to get supplies that they need, and they feel very nervous when they're around other people, but they genuinely care about other people, and other characters want to care about them. But what does that look like? It looks different depending on how you handle social interactions. And so I really liked that element of the story. And also to add, I do think that the romantic plotline is very, very sweet. And speaking of sweet romantic plotlines, the Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches has an absolutely darling love story as well as found family, similar to the Spellshop. And in this one, you are following a young woman who is a witch living in our own world. People do not actually know witches truly exist, and as a result, they have to keep their identities a secret. One day, though, this young woman gets a call from some people who happen to be mentors to 3 young orphan witches. They know about the powers that these girls have, but they also recognize that they don't have the ability to control their powers, and thus it is very easy for them to be discovered by the outside world, and they need somebody who has a little bit of expertise with their powers to teach these young girls how to kind of rein them in. And so the main character accepts this job. The caretakers for the little girls are all very precious human beings in this story, and the love interest is very protective and very kind, and I really liked the development not only of how the main character's characterization was done in the story, but also the other characters and how they all kind of came together. I think that's a key factor in delivering a really lovely found family in a story, is not just how everybody serves the main character, but how they all come together for each other. The next two recommendations are ones that are more fitting that classic fantasy feel. And in doing so, I think they just touch on something that we don't get in a lot of modern fantasy, that feeling of being told a tale that I think just has something integral to the feeling of winter. And the two recommendations would be Mercedes Lackey's Arrows trilogy, the first book in particular, which is very, very short, and then the other one would be Green Rider. With the Arrows trilogy, the first book is following the character when she's very, very young. You pick up as the reader pretty quickly that she is living in an abusive environment, and when she is able to then go to a more welcoming environment, you are just kind of watching her start to blossom and open up and learn to trust people. And she has mentor figures that have the absolute most darling interactions. Her and this one old man in particular are the absolute cutest, and I get teary-eyed just thinking about them because it is so sweet, and it just kind of feels like children with their grandparents, that kind of feel where everybody just wants the other person to be happy, and it's so sweet, and there's this sense of peaceful wisdom. And so for that element pretty much alone, I would recommend that first book in the Arrows trilogy. The series does progress as the character, whose name is Talia, grows up, so I would say it gets a lot more brutal and intense within books 2 and especially book 3, but if you want the cozy factor, book 1 definitely fits that. And then Green Rider is kind of that classic, there's this great evil, and there are characters that are fighting against that, and the interesting part is it's kind of in the background, and the rest of society, when the story starts, doesn't really know about it. Our main character is basically traveling from a point A to point B, and happens to come across a messenger who is dying, and as they die, they beg the character to please get this message to the person who needs it delivered to them. And she decides, okay, I'll do this. And then she's now on the run. And this is when just how much evil is lurking around the corner is starting to be known. There does happen to be a lot of that traveling feeling that I think a lot of us find is present in a lot of classic fantasy. So, you know, she'll stop at an area and she'll talk to these people, and this next area is this town where it turns out there's actually something really dangerous going on here. Then she goes to this other place and people will want to turn her in. So you have something constantly making you wonder, is this place safe, or is she in danger, or is she actually able to finally rest? And then also there's the greater threat in the background. I definitely really enjoyed this first book. I'll admit I have a lot more to go because there's a lot of books in this series, but I am excited to continue on, and I think it just has that cozy, classic fantasy feel. I have to mention for these next two, because they are just the perfect fantasy winter reads. Everybody, it feels, has to mention these, and I'm going to include myself in that, which would be the Winter Night trilogy and Spinning Silver. These are great if you are looking for a very atmospheric winter read. So a lot of fall recommendations, actually, I feel like people want things to do with fae and folklore, and they want to feel tied to the environment, but in ways that have to do with changes and something that feels very manipulative, and something where it's almost like death is a part of it, as it's kind of tied to the fall season and the leaves are falling from the trees. Whereas with winter, it's like death is here. Nothing is thriving right now, and everybody's in danger as a result. We're just trying to survive, and so there's almost an element of survival fantasy within Spinning Silver and The Bear and the Nightingale, or Winter Night trilogy. So with The Bear and the Nightingale, I think that's more true. You are absolutely seeing the way that months in advance, this small village is trying to prepare for the winter. It's historical, so there's a lot of elements to do with societal expectations, and also how religion plays a role in things, and how religion clashes with the ways of nature, we'll say, and our main character is much more in tune with the ways of nature, and that ends up clashing with religious figures. There is this sense of almost like horror as well that I think is really well captured. And on top of that, there is this feeling of old magic within it. So it kind of fits into that umbrella of almost classic fantasy, but it's not quite classic fantasy. And the writing style is kind of formal a little bit, but I think it's very fitting to planting you into that environment where you don't feel like it feels overly modern because it is a historical setting. It almost feels like the writing is matching that, which isn't to say that it is uninviting or really, really dense by any means. I think it just captures the setting within the writing and the prose itself. And then with Spinning Silver, this is a story that is also historical fantasy, very tied to the environment. And you are following a young woman whose family is mistreated because of the fact that they are Jewish, and her father is a moneylender, but he feels he cannot really do his job because anytime he has to collect, people immediately start drawing back on horrible stereotypes, or they start to paint him as villainous. And so he, in fear, starts to stop collecting, but that means that our main character Miriam and her family are suffering the consequences. She decides, I am done with people taking advantage of us. She starts to not only collect, but she also starts to gain their interest as well that is owed to them. And in doing this, this captures the attention of basically like the Fae, who feel that this concept is like turning silver into gold. She's making this profit, and they're very curious about this. They end up kind of whisking her along into what they have going on, and then this all ends up tying to other characters, some of whom have even less than Miriam and are also struggling, and there's a lot to do with how you can actually have a very dangerous environment in your home life, and then it extends all the way up to what are basically like nobles and how they have to navigate courts. But on top of that, there are also potentially some magical influences that are dangerous as well. And so all these different things are coming together, and I feel like in describing it, it seems like a lot's going on, and also like it's not necessarily the typical kinds of stakes you get in a fantasy story, so maybe it doesn't sound that gripping or that exciting. But I just found this to really not only capture the dangers of winter, the environment, the setting, but how people can both be very, very terrible, how nature itself can be very harsh, but then also the phrase I always use, the quiet ways in which people can be heroes, or the quiet ways in which people can fight back and be strong. So you're not going to get necessarily these epic battles the way something like Bloodsworn that I talked about at the beginning has, but you are going to have very satisfying moments when characters finally say, no, I've had enough. The last two are quite different from everything else, but I still wanted to include them. One of them would be House of Salt and Sorrows. This one to me is great for if you want to read something that is more like a spooky cabin read, if you will. And I know for some people, with how much darkness there is in winter, they actually do gravitate towards things that feel a little scarier. So if that's the case for you, House of Salt and Sorrows might fit the bill. This one is following this manor by the sea where there is this family that has all of these daughters, and every year pretty much at least one of them is dying, and so they're in this constant state of mourning, and they start to question, both they in the family and then people outside the family, if this family is cursed, and then you are starting to explore if that is the case or not. And then the last one for today, it's actually a very devastating one to end on. It doesn't really fit quite within any of the other categories, but that would be Burial Rites. This is a historical fiction story that is rooted in real events, which makes it, I think, that much more difficult to read, but it's about the last woman to be executed in Iceland. And this really does a great job of showing the ways that the world can inflict cruelty just simply based off of their perception of things, whether those perceptions are correct or not. And throughout the story, there is almost like this murder mystery element to it, as you know that in some way the main character was tied to the death of someone, but you don't know the full picture. And what happens is that she's going to be sentenced to be executed. They are allowing her in the last bits of her life to try to repent, essentially, and have these burial rites. And they send her to live with this family who supposedly uphold everything it means to be a good person, in hopes that this will help convince this woman to try to save herself before she dies. And it is through the interactions that this woman has with this family who is having to take care of her that she starts to slowly explain to you the situation. It is very heartbreaking. It is very difficult to read. I also will add, I happened to have read this when I was in Iceland, and I was in a similar area to where the book takes place. You can actually visit the grave, if I'm not mistaken, for this person. So it's a very difficult story to read. Obviously, aspects of it are fictionalized, but incorporated within it are real historical documents, you could say. So for example, I think there's a note about the axe head that's going to be used for the execution. It's very brutal, but if you are a fan of historical fiction, especially historical fiction that ties in real events and just the brutality of how humans can be, and you like reading those things because you want society to push forward, and you do feel like historical fiction in a similar sense to how history itself kind of informs us of what's to come, or just in general kind of makes you more aware. I think that this book definitely accomplishes that, and I don't know if too many other things capture winter and the cold quite like this story does. And it actually ends up determining for the character a lot of the events of her life, which I think is true of a lot of really well done stories that utilize winter within the setting. It almost is like an antagonist and a character in and of itself. I think that this book does that very, very well. As I said at the beginning, if you have any of your own recommendations, please feel free to leave them. Thanks so much for watching, though. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.